A couple weeks ago, I reviewed a batch of anime Yu-Gi-Oh cards, and it was really exciting. We kind of compared the actual TCG versions of the cards to the anime versions, and in all of those cases, as well as the cases in this video, the anime versions were either greatly changed or changed enough to where they were a lot better than the actual TCG cards. And in today's video, we're going to do the same thing. So I went through that video's comments, and I kind of saw what you guys wanted me to review, and maybe down the road, we'll do a video where we look at cards that got worse when they actually hit the anime versus the TCG. I think that'd be interesting, but for now, let's talk about some cards that got better in the anime. So first off, let's talk about number 101, Silent Honor Ark. Now this one's a little tricky because, kind of like Card Demise from the last video, this card actually was played a lot when it came out and pretty much wasn't power crept until Castel came out, and the reason being is that this card had several powerful effects. It could steal monsters, it could protect itself. It was a pretty versatile rank 4 monster, but the anime effect has two key differences. So the first one is that it makes it so it can't be destroyed by battle except with number monsters. Now, from what I've heard, and I'm pretty sure I'm right on this, every single number monster in the anime that they're from have this protection effect. So that part isn't super unique. Obviously, it makes this card a lot better, but we're going to kind of ignore that because the main difference between Silent Honor Ark in the anime and the version in the TCG is that in the anime, you only had to detach one exceed material from it to steal an opponent's monster. And that makes a huge difference, mainly because with the mechanic in place where you have to detach both of the materials to steal a monster, you now only have one material under it, so you can't steal a monster during your opponent's next turn. But by only having to attach one material, you can pretty much always steal something every single turn, and that makes this card a lot more deadly. And I can't even really imagine this card with that effect in the TCG. It would have been played way more than it already was, but I mean, it was played a lot just with its current effect in the TCG. So I think that if this card actually did have this effect, the one difference you'd probably see is that a lot of people would actually consider this card as a counter to Castel, in terms of when you have like that last slot in your extra deck and you're trying to think about what rank 4 you should play, the choice wouldn't be so clear cut like, oh, you always play Castel, just because Silent Honor Ark is a card that you can stick on board and repeatedly steal monsters until your opponent manages to kill it. This obviously becomes way more difficult if you add on the cannot be disturbed by battle effect by number monsters, but even ignoring that, the anime effect, just changing that one number on the card's text, makes a huge difference. Number 101 was an example of a time that the anime effect and the TCG effect aren't that different, but just different enough to make the card absolutely insane. And the next example is going to be a little bit more different in the comparison between the two cards. So let's look at Call of the Haunted. In the TCG, this card is a continuous trap card that revives one monster in attack position. You guys are probably all fairly familiar with it. It's a card that's seen play many times over the past 15 years, but the anime version in the original anime looks like episode 17 and 18. This card was ridiculous. So it was a normal spell card, and all it did was revive every single monster in your graveyard, and it makes them zombie type. So it's basically a better soul charge. It has no life point cost, it has no battle phase skipping. It's just a straight revive every card in your graveyard and make it a zombie type. Obviously this card would be busted. I mean, we can really just look at Call of the Haunted and say that card was limited in its current capacity for many years and only recently came back to 3 copies per deck. But this anime version of Call of the Haunted is a strictly better version of Soul Charge in basically every single way. Maybe there's like some convoluted downside to bringing the monsters back as zombies, but for the most part, this card would be a staple 3 of in every single deck out there, so it's probably a good thing that it didn't get printed. 100 Eyes Dragon was a pretty staple card in the original Synchro Infernity list, mainly used for copying Infernity Mirage and keeping your plays going. Nowadays, it's really not played in anything, but it's kind of a cool monster that can copy effects in your graveyard. However, a couple people pointed out that the anime version is like one of the most broken cards in the entire game if it actually had this effect. So the first thing that I do want to mention is that this was a dark synchro monster in the anime. I'm not super familiar with the mechanics, but just judging by the Wikia here, it says that that in order to special summon this card, subtract the level of a Dark Tuner monster from one level or level of one other monster you control. The value must equal the level of this card. So Dark Synchro is sort of a thing that never actually made it into the TCG. Actually, the cards themselves do kind of look like Exceed monsters, ironically, but even ignoring that, even ignoring the fact that it is a little harder to summon than the version in the actual TCG that's just a standard level 8 Synchro, this card is crazy. So its two effects are as follows. This card gains the effects of all dark monsters in your graveyard, and then also when this card is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, select one card from your deck and add it to your hand. So that first effect just logistically doesn't work. I mean, it simply does not make any sense to have one card on the field copy every single card in your graveyard, even if it restricts it to just the dark monsters. There's so many ridiculous combos that come out of that. I mean, just in the past with like Starving Venom Dragon, we've seen just copying one monster in your graveyard is actually too overpowered to be legal in the TCG, because there are so many monsters in the game that you can copy that are just totally unfair. So the fact that this thing copies every dark monster, I mean, oh my gosh, that just makes so many FTKs and OTKs, it would be insane. And also it would cause a ton of ruling issues, I'm sure. But then also it has this effect that if you do manage to kill this thing, they can just search any card in their deck and add it to their hand. I think about the Curious Lightsworn Link monster, which adds a card from your graveyard to your hand when it's destroyed, and that card is already really annoying to deal with because your opponent can just pick whichever the best card in the graveyard is, add it back to their hand. But 100 Eyes Dragon actually takes that a step further and just lets you search anything in your deck. This card is probably one of the most overpowered monster cards I've ever seen. Thank you so much, because a lot of people actually did comments like, you have to go look at this card, and now that I did, I can certainly say that this card should never be printed this way. No card should be printed that copies more than like one effect in the graveyard, and even some might say that you shouldn't print any cards that copy effects in the graveyard because they're only bound to make a lot more FTKs happen, as we kind of saw with Starving Venom Dragon. It's quite possible that you have never seen the card Virus Cannon. It's pretty bad. You contribute any number of non-token monsters you control, and then for each tributed monster, your opponent sends one spell card from their deck to the graveyard. So at maximum, when this card was printed, your opponent would send 5 cards to the graveyard. At the moment, technically they could send 6 cards to the graveyard, but overall it's just not a very strong card, and that kind of explains why it's never seen play. However, did you know that in the anime, this card not only was a spell card, but also just had this insane effect where all it did was just get rid of all of your opponent's spell cards from their hand and deck. It had no cost, it had no drawback, no setup required. You could just activate this thing against your Sky Striker opponent, and they would have like a 5-card deck, and then you would just win the game because all of their stuff's in the graveyard. I actually think this card is kind of interesting from a design standpoint. Obviously not without any restrictions, but I think from like a gameplay standpoint, it'd be kind of interesting to have a card that sends all of one type, or maybe like half of one type of a card from your opponent's hand and deck to the graveyard, simply as a way to combat the strategies that only use one type of card. However, I think that this card in the current form from the anime is obviously way too overpowered to print. However, I do think it's kind of interesting. Maybe someday down the line we can have like a card that maybe like after 3 turns or after 5 turns does this sort of effect. Maybe with monsters. Monsters are a lot easier to like actually recover, whereas spell cards, once they're in the graveyard, they're usually in the graveyard for good. So maybe a card like this that sends like 10 monsters from your opponent's deck to the graveyard, which could potentially help them, but also in some matchups actually just really hurt them. Anyway though, what do you guys think of these anime effects? Once again, I did want to look at effects that actually got worse when they were transferred to the TCG. I mentioned in the first video, I'll mention it again here, a lot of these cards, from what I can tell, are actually just simply designed to sort of be plot armor specific. They're supposed to go with the story. I mean, the Yu-Gi-Oh anime is more of an entertainment experience, not so much somewhere where you're looking for intense, real to true to life duels, and that's really important when looking at these cards and saying, wow, they don't have any drawbacks and they're completely ridiculous. Well, the reason that that's actually acceptable is because they're not being played in a tournament setting, they're simply being played in an anime setting, which is obviously very, very different. But I will see you guys later. Let me know your comments, and I do still want to do that video where I look at cards that got worse when they actually moved into the anime from the TCG. I know, I guess it's usually the other way around, but I guess what I'm trying to say is I want cards that got better when they're in the TCG versus when they were in the anime, and I don't know if that happened too often. I got a couple comments in the last video, but people seem to be more interested in telling me about cards other than what I talked about that got just like absolutely insane anime effects. But I think it'd be interesting to sort of flip this format on its head, so let me know in the comment section below if you know of any cards that fit those criteria. I will see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.